I've loved mountain biking for as long as I can remember. I got my first proper bike when I was around 12 or 13, and I've been hitting the trails ever since. I've never been a competitive rider. I don't keep track of my times or distances. I just enjoy the freedom of the trails, my music in the background, and the rhythm of the ride. One Saturday morning in late spring, I woke up to perfect weather. It was one of those days that begged for an adventure. I decided to ride up to a spot high in the hills that offered a stunning view of the coastline. It wasn't my usual route since it was a bit of a trek, but I felt like taking on the challenge. After driving to the trailhead, I unloaded my bike, checked my gear, and got ready to head out. Nearby, I noticed a couple preparing their bikes as well. They looked to be in their early 20s, close to my age. We started chatting. Honestly, I don't recall who spoke first, and I hit it off with the woman. She said she often biked in the area, though I hadn't seen her before. She seemed friendly, like someone I'd get along with. She introduced me to her boyfriend, who also loved mountain biking. They talked about their favorite local trails, and they both seemed like good company. When they invited me to join them on one of their preferred routes, I figured, why not? It'd be nice to make new friends and explore some unfamiliar trails. We left the parking lot together and began the climb. At the first fork in the path, we paused to catch our breath. The woman pointed to a trail I hadn't ridden before and suggested we head that way. It quickly became apparent that they were much faster riders than me. They raced ahead with ease while I struggled to keep up. Still, I was determined to push myself and managed to stay within about 10 yards of them most of the time. After about 45 minutes of riding, we stopped for a water break. I noticed that the woman had left her backpack partially unzipped, which seemed odd. I didn't dwell on it, though. A moment later, I stepped into the trees for a quick bathroom break. That's when everything changed. Out of nowhere, I heard laughter and then the sound of their bikes speeding off. By the time I rushed back to my bike, they were completely out of sight. What annoyed me even more was discovering that both of my tires had been slashed. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. Frustrated and unsure what to do, I sat on a rock to collect myself. The sun was now high in the sky, and it was getting uncomfortably hot. I eventually decided to start walking my bike down the trail. About 15 minutes later, I noticed something strange. A wire stretched across the path, tied between two small trees at about chest height. If I'd been riding, it could have seriously injured me or worse. I stood there staring at it, trying to piece things together. Why would they do this? Or maybe they weren't responsible at all, and someone else had set this trap. Either way, it was unsettling. I used my pocket knife to cut the wire, deciding then and there to head back the way I'd come. I didn't want any more surprises. The hike back to the parking lot was grueling, about 6 miles, but I eventually made it. When I got there, the couple's car was gone. I stopped at the nearby ranger station to report what had happened. I gave them a description of the couple, but without much identifying information, there wasn't much they could do. They filed a report and I went home. I never heard anything more about that couple or what happened that day. I also never returned to those trails. Wandering through forests has been a passion of mine for as long as I can recall. So, when the opportunity arose to tackle the Pacific Ridge Trail, I seized it. I'd never embarked on such an extensive solo hike before, but I was determined to rise to the challenge. For those unfamiliar, the Pacific Ridge Trail stretches nearly 2,000 miles, weaving through California, Oregon, and Washington. It's a unique blend of thrilling challenges and serene seclusion, framed by lush woods, peaceful valleys, and towering mountains. Along the path, small towns and outposts cater to hikers, offering food, supplies, and shelter to those venturing through. To ease into the experience, I spent the first few nights camping with groups of other hikers I met along the trail. We exchanged stories, shared meals, and enjoyed the camaraderie of like-minded adventurers. But after 3 nights, I decided to set up camp alone. It was my chance to prove I could handle this journey independently. As the sun set that first solo night, a faint unease began creeping in. I told myself it was simply the absence of the friendly company I had grown accustomed to. But the uneasiness didn't fade. I spent the next 3 nights alone, and the discomfort only intensified. I started to feel as though someone or something was watching me. It was an absurd thought, I knew, but the sensation was unrelenting. One morning, I woke to find my backpack slightly unzipped. At first, I thought I must have forgotten to close it properly, but it didn't seem like something I would overlook. Stranger still, a few items appeared to have been moved. Not far, but just enough to seem deliberate, like they had been handled and put back in slightly different spots. Feeling rattled, I chose to camp near other hikers for the next couple of nights. Though I felt silly about it, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Eventually, determined to overcome my fear, I decided to camp alone again. That night, the eerie feeling returned with a vengeance. It was so overwhelming that I decided to cut my hike short. When I reached the nearest town, I came up with an excuse for my early return, telling friends and family I'd twisted my knee and would have to attempt the hike again next year. Weeks later, as I was sorting through the photos I'd taken during the hike, I stumbled upon something chilling. Among the snapshots of scenic landscapes and campfire gatherings was an image that made my blood run cold. It was a photo of me, fast asleep in my tent. At first, I thought it might have been a joke from one of the hikers I'd camped with earlier in the trip. But as I scrolled through more pictures, the truth began to sink in. There were several photos of me sleeping, each taken on the nights I had camped alone. It wasn't a prank. Someone had been watching me, following me from campsite to campsite. My camera had captured what I hadn't seen with my own eyes. The weight of that realization hit me hard. I had never been truly alone. Ryan and I were both in our mid-teens, and let's just say we had a knack for getting into adventurous situations. Nothing dangerous, just the kind of mischief 2 teenage boys with too much time during summer vacation might stumble into. But that one day, is etched vividly in my memory. It began like any other. Ryan's older sister, Megan, was with us. She was about 2 years older, maybe 17 if I remember right. The 3 of us lived in a small rural community in southern Georgia. It was far from the sunny beaches or high-rise cities you'd associate with the South. No, our area was a quiet, swampy region, just a stone's throw from the Okefenokee Swamp. Developers had drained part of the wetlands decades ago to build houses, and we lived in one of those neighborhoods. It was a blistering Friday afternoon, and we'd been playing hide and seek in the overgrown lots near the woods. Megan mentioned she wanted to have a cigarette, and Ryan decided to join her. I wasn't into smoking, so I just hung around as they lit up. We stood on the edge of a clearing, debating what to do next. Then someone, I can't recall who, had the idea to explore the woods. Ryan claimed there was a stream nearby where we could cool off. A dip in the water sounded amazing on a day like that, so none of us hesitated. We headed into the forest, walking for what must have been 15 or 20 minutes. That's when I realized we hadn't thought about how we'd find our way back. Southern forests all look alike. Tall oaks draped in moss, dense palmetto bushes, and pine needles carpeting the ground. None of us had thought to mark a trail. I took out my phone to call my mom, but there was no signal. I suggested we head back, pointing out the looming thunderclouds common to summer afternoons. Megan and Ryan agreed, but somehow we got turned around. Megan, it turned out, had zero sense of direction and unknowingly led us deeper into the woods. 30 minutes later, nothing looked familiar. Everything around us, the plants, the trees, seemed like a copy of what we'd passed before. I decided to take charge. My plan was simple. If we found an open area, We might get a cell signal or flag someone for help. We walked for another half hour, tired, thirsty, and scratched from pushing through sharp palmetto fronds. At some point, I started to think we'd crossed into the protected forest preserve nearby. As we pushed on, Megan spotted something unusual, a hunting stand. It was strange because hunting was strictly banned in the area. Then Ryan noticed something even weirder. A cluster of metal cages, at least 15 of them, scattered around. Most were large and propped open with sticks. Some had dried blood smeared on the edges, and one looked as if it had been violently kicked from the inside. Megan speculated they were for trapping wild hogs, though none of us had ever seen one in the area. Creepy as it was, we had no choice but to keep moving. Ryan kept trying to get a signal on his phone but had no luck. By now, we were filthy, exhausted, and completely unprepared for such an ordeal. A quick hike to a river had somehow turned into an hours-long test of endurance. We eventually stopped to rest. I sat on a fallen log with Megan while Ryan wandered off, holding his phone up, desperate for a signal. He was gone for maybe 10 minutes when we heard him scream. Megan and I bolted toward the sound, but I froze when I saw them. Two men, crouched in the underbrush, staring straight at us. One looked like he was in his 60s, with shoulder-length white blonde hair and a face weathered by years outdoors. His tattered denim shirt was filthy and shredded. The other man was much younger, maybe mid-20s, and oddly clean-cut, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks. Neither wore shoes. They crouched there, their arms hanging limply at their sides, grinning at us. They didn't move. My heart pounded as I instinctively crouched too, locking eyes with the older man. After what felt like an eternity, though it was probably a minute or two, he stood and darted into the trees, the younger one following close behind. Ryan reappeared moments later, sobbing and asking why we hadn't come when he screamed. I explained what we'd seen, and his tears stopped. He went pale and quiet. For the next 20 minutes, we walked in silence, each of us too shaken to speak. Relief flooded over us when we finally stumbled onto a paved bike trail that cut through the preserve. We found a signal and called our parents. Sitting on the asphalt, we cried together, overwhelmed with exhaustion and gratitude. My mom arrived with water and scolded me for wandering into the woods, but I could tell she was just relieved I was okay. When I told her about the two men, she decided to report it to the forest rangers. I gave them my account, but I never heard back. 2 weeks later, Ryan came over to hang out, and he brought up the incident. He confessed something chilling. When he was looking for a signal, he hadn't seen the men Megan and I saw. Instead, he'd heard heavy footsteps, something crashing through the underbrush, coming toward him fast. He hid behind a fallen tree, terrified. When the noise stopped, he peeked out and saw a woman crouching nearby. Her hair and clothes were matted with dried blood. She stared at him before silently turning and running into the forest. To this day, no one has found any trace of the people we encountered. As for me, I've never stepped foot in those woods again. It was meant to be an ordinary trek. I needed to clear my thoughts and get away from the bustle of the city. I chose a less traveled trail, hoping for solitude. The sky was gray, but I wasn't worried. The forecast mentioned no rain, just overcast skies all day. The hike began easily, winding through a dense woodland filled with towering trees. The air was brisk, carrying the scent of wet soil and fallen leaves. I settled into a steady pace, enjoying the calm. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional flutter of birds startled into flight. After about an hour, the incline became steeper. It was challenging but invigorating, and I relished the exertion as I climbed higher. The trees grew sparse, gradually giving way to jagged rocks. The wind picked up, sending a chill through the air. I paused to catch my breath and take a sip of water. That's when I noticed it, the quiet. It wasn't the same peaceful stillness I had experienced earlier. This silence felt unnatural, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, blaming the eerie sensation on the thin air, and pushed onward. The trail narrowed as I climbed, and the rocks beneath my feet became unstable. Every step required caution. One misstep could send me tumbling down the slope. Above me, the clouds thickened, and daylight seemed to wane, even though it wasn't late. The dimness was unsettling, and an uneasy feeling crept into my stomach, but I forced myself to focus on the path. After another half hour, I reached a ridge. The view was breathtaking. A vast expanse of forest stretching below, with hazy mountains in the distance. Yet, something felt off. Scanning my surroundings, I noticed a faint, barely visible path leading further up the mountain. It wasn't marked on any map and seemed untouched by hikers. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore. The path was rugged, disappearing entirely in some spots. I had to scramble over rocks to continue. The wind was stronger here, biting through my clothing and numbing my skin. Part of me screamed to turn back, but I pressed on. Eventually, I saw it, a small, dilapidated shack. It was old, built from dark, weather-worn planks that blended almost perfectly with the surroundings. I hadn't expected to find anything like it this far off the main trail. The cabin appeared abandoned. Its windows were shattered, and the door sagged on broken hinges. My unease grew, but my curiosity kept me moving forward. I approached slowly, a growing sense of dread gnawing at my gut. The place felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be there, or like I wasn't meant to be there. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly in protest. Inside, the air was stale and carried a nauseating mix of rot and dust. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped in. Old furniture lay draped in cobwebs, and the fireplace was filled with cold ash. As I ventured further inside, my heart pounded. Then, in the corner, I saw them. A pile of bones, partially buried beneath rubble. They were yellowed but not ancient and unmistakably human. A wave of cold terror washed over me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Who had died here? What had happened? And why had I been the one to stumble upon this? I didn't wait to find out. Turning, I bolted out of the cabin. My breathing panicked. The loose rocks underfoot made the descent treacherous, but I didn't care. I slipped more than once, barely managing to avoid falling. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. When I finally reached the main trail, I didn't stop. I ran all the way back to the trailhead, where my car was parked. I climbed in, started the engine, and sped away without a backward glance. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that wanted to remain undisturbed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pile of bones. The oppressive silence of the cabin haunted me. It wasn't just silence, but something far more sinister. Months later, I received a call from local authorities. They had investigated the cabin after my report and confirmed the presence of human remains. However, they couldn't identify them or explain how they had ended up there. The case was left unsolved. But what they told me next chills me to this day. A week after their initial visit, they returned to the site. This time, the cabin was empty. The bones were gone, and the debris had been cleared away as though no one, and nothing, had ever been there. I haven't gone hiking since. Occasionally, I think about that cabin and the bones inside, wondering what really happened. Deep down, though, I know some mysteries are better left alone. Some things don't want to be found, and will do whatever it takes to stay hidden. The moon hung low in the night sky as I ventured deeper into the woods. With every step, the trees seemed to press closer, their thick branches weaving together and swallowing what little light remained. What I thought would be a simple shortcut quickly turned into a labyrinth of twisting trunks and shifting shadows. The ground beneath my boots was damp and spongy, carrying the pungent scent of wet soil. Occasionally, the soft rustle of leaves would freeze me in place, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. Though only minutes had passed, it felt like I had been wandering for hours. The forest was unnervingly quiet, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or the far-off call of a bird. My phone was useless. No signal, and its faint screen glow did nothing to pierce the overwhelming darkness. I shoved it back into my jacket, relying on the weak moonlight to guide me forward. The gnarled trees seemed alive, their twisted limbs stretching toward me as if they intended to ensnare me. I tried to convince myself it was all in my imagination, but the sensation of unseen eyes following my every move grew with every step. My pulse quickened, and beads of sweat rolled down my back, cold despite the exertion. I pushed through a thicket of tangled bushes, their branches clawing at my arms, and stumbled into a small clearing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could see the stars faintly glimmering overhead. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me, but it was short-lived. My gaze caught on something lying among the fallen leaves. A shoe. It was battered and worn, its laces frayed and almost disintegrating. I hesitated, my breath hitching as I crouched to inspect it. It was old, too old for anyone to still be wearing, but it was here in the middle of nowhere where it shouldn't be. Standing abruptly, my mind raced to find some reasonable explanation, but nothing fit. The vastness of the woods could explain someone getting lost, sure, but this felt wrong. The air around me seemed to shift. The gentle rustling of leaves and faint sounds of distant animals stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. My skin prickled as the weight of the quiet pressed in on me. I told myself to move, to get out, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Forcing myself to break free of the clearing, I quickened my pace, desperate to find the path I'd come in on. But the forest was relentless. The further I went, the more unfamiliar everything became. Each tree looked identical to the last, and the trail I thought I was following had vanished. A knot of fear coiled tightly in my stomach. My breaths grew short and panicked as the trees loomed ever closer, their shadowy forms suffocating, unyielding. I tried retracing my steps, but it was no use. I was utterly lost. My heart pounded, my vision blurred, and my legs began to tremble. Just as despair started to take hold, I heard it. A faint hum, distant but unmistakable. I froze, straining to distinguish the sound from the thundering of my heartbeat. It was an engine, far off but steadily approaching. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest, and I surged forward, crashing through the undergrowth toward the sound. The trees began to thin, and I pushed myself harder, my body burning with the effort. The hum grew louder until finally, I burst from the suffocating embrace of the forest and onto an empty roadway. Headlights cut through the darkness as a car approached. I waved frantically, my arms aching but relief surging through me as the vehicle slowed. The driver, an older man with a kind, weathered face, rolled down the window and asked if I was all right. Nodding shakily, I explained I had gotten lost in the woods. He offered me a ride to the nearest town, and I climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. As we drove away, I glanced back at the trees. They stood still and tall, bathed in pale moonlight, but something caught my eye at the forest's edge. A shadowy figure lingered just beyond the tree line, barely discernible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, hoping I had imagined it, but when I looked again, the figure remained motionless, watching. I turned away quickly, trying to focus on the road ahead. Yet the chill in my bones stayed with me, impossible to shake. Though I had escaped the forest, I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that whatever had been watching me wasn't done. The thought gnawed at me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As the car sped down the empty highway, I tried to convince myself I was safe. But deep down, I knew I would never forget that night, or the presence that might still be waiting in the shadows for me to return. I had a small cabin tucked away deep in the forest, where I'd retreat every autumn for hunting season. The cabin was basic, just one room with wooden walls that groaned whenever the wind blew hard. It was far from any nearby town, surrounded by dense trees that were nearly impossible to navigate in some areas. I liked its isolation. It made hunting simpler, and the solitude made the forest feel like it belonged to me alone. One evening, after a long day of tracking game, I decided to return to the cabin before the sun fully set. The light was fading, and the trees cast long, dark shadows across the forest floor as I made my way back. The woods felt unusually silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots against the dirt. The stillness felt unsettling, but I brushed it off. Forests could be unpredictable, and my priority was getting back before nightfall. When I finally reached the cabin, I lit a fire in the old stone hearth and made a simple dinner. The warmth and familiarity of the cabin helped ease my nerves, and I soon settled into one of the worn chairs, listening to the comforting crackle of the flames. The cabin was modest, but it was my sanctuary, a place where I could leave the outside world behind. Yet that night, something felt different. As the hours passed, an uneasy feeling crept over me, as though I wasn't truly alone. The wind howled, rattling the windows and causing the door to creak, but I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a trick of the mind brought on by being isolated in such a remote place. Then I heard it, faint but distinct footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from outside the cabin. I froze, every sense heightened. The footsteps moved in a steady circle around the cabin, crunching leaves with each step. My first thought was that it could be an animal, maybe a large one like a bear, but the sound was too deliberate. It didn't seem random. It felt purposeful, as though someone or something was inspecting the place. My heart pounded as I reached for the rifle leaning against the wall beside me. The footsteps stopped abruptly, right in front of the door. For a few moments, everything was silent again. Holding my breath, I gripped the rifle tightly, my eyes locked on the door. The tension in the air was unbearable, every second dragging on endlessly. Then, without warning, the door handle jiggled. It wasn't forceful, more of a cautious testing of the latch. My hands trembled slightly as I stood, raising the rifle and aiming at the door. The handle moved again, as though someone on the other side was pushing it, testing its strength. I didn't call out. I didn't want to reveal my fear or even confirm I was inside. Instead, I stepped quietly to the side, keeping my weapon trained on the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a lost hiker, a trespasser, or something more sinister? Out here, miles from anyone, no one would hear if something went wrong. The handle rattled harder, and I knew the door wouldn't hold much longer. Tightening my grip on the rifle, I prepared for whatever or whoever was on the other side. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The handle stilled, and the footsteps resumed, slowly retreating from the cabin. I listened as they faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest, until only the sound of the wind remained. I didn't move for a long time, straining to hear if the intruder might return. When the forest remained silent, I finally allowed myself to exhale. I checked the door's lock and pushed a heavy chair against it for good measure before sitting back down, rifle still in hand. I stared at the door until exhaustion overwhelmed me, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. When dawn broke, the first light filtering through the trees brought a small measure of relief. Whatever or whoever had been out there was gone, but the proof of their presence remained. Faint footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the dense undergrowth. That morning, I packed my things, locked up the cabin as securely as I could, and left. I never went back. The forest, once a peaceful refuge, now felt different, wrong even. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing among the trees. But there was nothing, just the winding road and the dark woods. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. I'm not sure I want to know. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. Yet, sometimes, when I'm alone and the world falls quiet, I can almost hear those footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, circling me. Just last year, during the hottest days of the season, I decided to explore the woods outside my small town. Hardly anyone ever went there. The trees were massive, their branches stretching wide to almost block out the sky. The air always felt damp and heavy, like the ground had never fully dried. I'd heard rumors about odd noises and peculiar animal behavior in the area, but I wasn't the type to believe in such things. I set out around midday, planning to return before sunset. The first hour was peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. I strolled slowly, enjoying the quiet, interrupted only by the occasional rustling of a bird or a squirrel in the underbrush. But as I ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to shift. The trees grew closer together, their bark darker and rougher. The undergrowth became denser, making it harder to move. It felt as if the forest was closing in around me. The trail I'd been following started to fade, eventually vanishing entirely. I told myself not to panic. I could just retrace my steps. But after a few more minutes, I realized nothing around me looked familiar. The air was stifling, and the forest, once serene, now felt alien and oppressive. A creeping sensation settled over me, as though unseen eyes were watching. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, but there was nothing, just more trees and shadows. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, only to find I had no signal. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind. Just an eerie stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I knew I had to head back, but every direction looked identical. Panic started to creep in as I quickened my pace, hoping to stumble upon something recognizable. It was no use. The forest felt endless, a labyrinth designed to keep me trapped. My pulse raced, and the unshakable feeling of being followed only grew stronger. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the sensation wouldn't leave. Fear took over and I began to run, not caring which way I went, just desperate to escape. Suddenly, I tripped and hit the ground hard. When I looked down, I saw an old, rusted metal trap, partially buried in the dirt. It looked like the kind used to catch animals, but it was ancient, forgotten. The sight sent a shiver through me, not because of the trap itself, but because it meant someone else had been there before. What if they never made it out? I forced myself to stay calm, brushing off the dirt and deciding to climb the nearest hill to get a better view. The terrain was uneven, with roots snaking across the ground, but I pushed on. When I finally reached the top, I caught a glimpse of the forest's edge where the trees gave way to open fields. It was far, but at least I had a direction. I gathered my courage and started moving, this time with more purpose. The hours seemed to drag, but slowly, the trees thinned out and more sunlight broke through the canopy. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I spotted it, a dirt road leading back toward town. Relief washed over me as I stumbled out of the trees and onto the path. As I walked home, the tension in my body began to fade. The forest, which had seemed so menacing just moments ago, now felt like a distant memory. But as I glanced back one last time, something caught my eye. In the dimming light, at the edge of the trees, a figure stood motionless. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me. Heart pounding, I turned away and quickened my pace, refusing to look back. When I reached my house, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I never returned to that forest. I told myself it was all in my head, that nothing was really out there. But deep down, I knew better. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I hear faint rustling outside my window, as if something is moving through the trees. I shut my eyes tightly and tell myself it's just the wind. But a part of me knows the truth. The forest is still there, waiting, and it never forgets those who wander into it. At the start, the moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the deserted road. I decided to take a late-night stroll, hoping the crisp air and stillness would help clear my thoughts. On my right, the cornfield stood like an impenetrable wall of dark green, the stalks softly rustling in the faint breeze. My footsteps echoed against the quiet, amplifying the sense of solitude. As I walked, an unshakable sense of unease began to creep over me. The road felt emptier than usual, and the darkness beyond the cornfield seemed endless. The rustling from the corn grew louder, almost like faint whispers carried by the night air. I told myself it was just the wind, yet my pace quickened as the sound grew more insistent. I glanced toward the corn, trying to spot the source of the noise. The field appeared still, but the nagging feeling that someone or something was hidden among the stalks sent chills through me. My heart thudded, each beat amplifying the growing fear. Then, a soft thump sounded behind me. I whipped around, only to find the road as empty as before. I took a shaky breath and continued walking, determined to push aside my unease. The shadows seemed to shift and lengthen, and every faint noise felt unnervingly loud. It was as if the night itself was closing in. Just as I began to regret venturing out alone, the beams of an approaching car pierced the darkness. The bright lights were almost blinding, and I raised my hand to shield my eyes. The car slowed to a stop beside me, and the driver rolled down the window, concern etched on his face. He asked if I was all right. I explained that I'd gone out for a nighttime walk and felt a bit unsettled. He nodded sympathetically and offered me a ride back into town. I hesitated at first, but eventually accepted, reassured by the genuine worry in his eyes. As the car moved away from the cornfield, I glanced back and watched it vanish into the distance. Gradually, the tension in my chest began to ease. When we reached town, I thanked the driver and got out, walking the rest of the way home. The streetlights were bright, and the familiar sights of my neighborhood offered a sense of safety. But as I neared my house, something stopped me in my tracks. Just outside the glow of the street lamp, a shadowy figure stood at the edge of the cornfield, watching me. My heart pounded as I froze in place. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silent and still, its presence unnervingly deliberate. The car's headlights had barely illuminated the field earlier, and now the darkness seemed to have reclaimed everything, concealing whatever or whoever was out there. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Summoning the courage to move, I unlocked my door and stepped inside, glancing back one last time. The figure was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Yet the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. Locking the door behind me, I shivered as the realization hit me. This encounter might not be over. The silence inside my house was thick, and even the familiar shadows seemed threatening, as if the night's menace had followed me home. The The sun had just dipped below the horizon as I made my way along the narrow trail leading to my small cabin nestled deep in the forest. The evening air was unusually still, no rustling branches, no singing insects. A dense fog began creeping in, swallowing the path ahead in a ghostly haze. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I let its beam cut through the murky darkness, casting distorted shadows on the nearby trees. The chill in the air was sharper than normal, and an uneasy shiver ran through me as I pressed forward on the winding trail. The woods, typically a place of peace and safety, felt stifling tonight, as though they were holding their breath, waiting for something unseen to unfold. As I rounded a bend, something strange caught my eye. A thick branch stretched across the path. It hadn't been there before. Its splintered ends and raw edges suggested it had been freshly broken. I stepped over it carefully, my nerves tingling. The oppressive quiet of the forest only seemed to deepen my unease. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, sending my heart into overdrive. I tapped it desperately, hoping it was just a dying battery. The dim light illuminated the forest in an eerie clarity, the gnarled tree trunks and tangled undergrowth appearing almost alive. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, each curve revealing more of the same foreboding woods. Though my cabin was close, the trail felt unfamiliar, as though it had shifted to keep me lost. I fixed my eyes on the faint outline of my cabin in the distance, willing it to guide me. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, trailing behind me. My pulse quickened. I sped up, my breath hitching as the noise grew louder, more urgent. I didn't dare glance back. I just kept moving, my legs burning as I hurried toward safety. When I finally stumbled up the porch steps, the sound stopped abruptly. Fumbling with the keys, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The forest was still and silent, its darkness giving away no secrets. I flung the door open, slammed it shut, and locked it with trembling hands. Inside, the cabin was warm, but the sense of relief was fleeting. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my racing heart. The danger outside seemed to have disappeared, but the quiet indoors felt heavier than usual. I sat near the fireplace, the flickering flames offering a small measure of comfort. Yet, as I surveyed the cozy room, an unsettling feeling crept over me. The stillness wasn't soothing. It felt charged, as though it was hiding something. The firelight danced on the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. My eyes wandered to the window, and my stomach dropped. The fog outside had thickened, and faint shapes moved within it. Though blurry, they appeared to drift and dart as if they were watching me. A sudden draft swept through the cabin, chilling me to the bone, though all the windows were firmly shut. My heart pounded as I realized I hadn't heard the door unlock. Then, the sound returned, the rhythmic thumping, but this time, it was coming from inside the cabin. The steady noise sent a wave of dread through me. Turning slowly, I scanned the dimly lit room for the source. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, growing darker and more menacing. My breath came faster as the sound crept closer, inching toward me. I forced myself to stay calm, straining to recall if I had left anything out of place. But as the thumping grew louder, more insistent, one thing became clear. I was no longer alone. The cabin, once my refuge, now felt like a cage. I moved cautiously, each step deliberate, toward the sound. The air was thick with tension, my every nerve on edge. When I reached the back of the room, I found nothing out of the ordinary. The space was empty, and the thumping had stopped. Relief was fleeting. Just as I turned to leave, something icy brushed the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was no one there. A chilling realization washed over me. Whatever had been in the woods had followed me inside. My once safe haven had become a trap. The silence returned, broken only by the faint, relentless thumping. It was no longer outside. It was here, and the nightmare I thought I'd outrun was only beginning. I had gone hiking alone in the hills, something I'd done plenty of times before. It was a little after midday, and the trail was almost empty. I enjoyed the solitude, the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. The air was cool, and sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting long, dappled shadows on the ground. Everything felt serene, too serene. When I reached a fork in the trail, I chose the path less traveled. It wasn't marked on my map, but it appeared to cut across to the main trail. I thought it might save some time. The deeper I ventured, the narrower and more overgrown the trail became. I should have turned back, but my stubbornness pushed me to keep moving forward. After about an hour, the trees began to close in, their branches weaving together overhead and blocking out the sunlight. The dim light gave the air a chill. The path that had already been hard to follow now seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. I checked my phone for GPS, but there was no signal. I told myself to stay calm, thinking I could retrace my steps. But when I turned around, nothing looked familiar. The way I had come was gone, and the forest seemed different, as if it had shifted behind me. A creeping panic set in, but I tried to focus. I chose a direction and began walking, hoping to stumble upon something recognizable. But every step seemed to take me deeper into the wilderness. I called out a few times, praying someone might hear me, but the trees absorbed my voice, and the only reply was the distant call of birds. As the hours passed, fear began to grow, but I pushed it aside, concentrating on survival. Find water, find shelter, keep moving. The sun began to dip lower, and the light faded. The shadows lengthened, and the temperature plummeted. I knew I had to find a safe spot to rest before darkness fully set in. Exhausted, my legs sore from climbing over fallen branches and pushing through thick foliage, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for the night. I gathered some dry leaves and sticks and managed to light a small fire. Its warmth brought some comfort, but my unease lingered. I tried to eat a few snacks from my pack, but anxiety twisted my stomach into knots, and I could only manage a few bites. As I sat there, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost, miles from the nearest trail, with no way to contact anyone. The night was long. Every sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the wind moving through the trees, set me on edge. My imagination painted vivid, terrifying scenarios, but I forced myself to focus. This was just nature. There was nothing out here but the forest and its wildlife, I told myself over and over, clinging to that thought like a lifeline. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over because I woke abruptly to the sound of movement nearby. My heart raced as I held my breath, straining to hear. Whatever it was close, too close. The fire had burned down to faint embers, and the clearing was cloaked in darkness. Then I saw it, two glinting eyes reflecting the dying firelight. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was a large animal, perhaps a deer or a stray coyote. I couldn't tell. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity before slowly backing away into the shadows of the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn's first light broke, I forced myself to stand, stiff and cold, and began walking. I didn't care where I went so long as it was away from that place. Driven by sheer determination, I trudged on, ignoring my aching legs and the heavy fatigue that pressed down on me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was likely only a few hours, I saw something that made my heart leap. A break in the trees. I quickened my pace, nearly running, and burst out onto an overgrown dirt road. It wasn't the trail, but it was something, a sign of civilization. I followed the road, and after a mile or two, I came upon an old cabin. Though it looked abandoned, I saw smoke curling up from its chimney. Nervously, I knocked on the door. An older man answered, his face lined with surprise at seeing me. I explained I was lost, and he kindly invited me in, offering food and water. Using his radio, he contacted the closest ranger station. Within a few hours, the rangers arrived and drove me back to my car, which was parked at the trailhead, miles from where I had ended up. As I drove home, the events of the last day played in my mind like a surreal dream. I was safe now. I had made it out. But one thing was clear. I would never hike alone or take unmarked paths again. Just as I began to feel at ease, a sound from the forest behind me made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. My pulse quickened. I glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing. I pressed the accelerator, my heart pounding, but the sound only grew louder, closer. When I finally reached my driveway, I shut off the car and sat frozen, realization dawning. I hadn't been alone in those woods. Whatever had followed me might still be out there, watching from the shadows.